I love seeing those children clap. It made me happy. Thank you. You may be seated.
I'm going to start with the story my wife told me last week. So she said I don't need to give her credit, but I'm doing it anyway. There was a lady that bought a puzzle from Barnes & Noble. She brought it home and she put it together. And like probably has happened to all of us, she was missing a piece. Well, it was a brand new puzzle. And she looked around and the piece was not there. So finally, she got in her mind that they had sold her a defective puzzle. And she brought it back to Barnes & Noble. Of course, Barnes & Noble did not want to take the puzzle back. But eventually, after arguing and arguing with them, they finally, just to, I think more to get rid of her than anything else, gave her money back and sent her on the way. Well, a few days later, she was cleaning and found the puzzle piece. It had fallen underneath the table. Well, she took a piece of tape with the puzzle piece and put it on her refrigerator with a note that said, "You are not always right." I think that's a lesson that we all need to learn at some point. We are not always right. We all make mistakes. It's a humbling lesson. And if we haven't learned it yet, eventually we will. When we're confronted with conflict, with discord, whether we're right or wrong, as in the case of the lady, it behooves us to react first, not with arguing, but with humility, for our sake and for the sake of others. And today that's what we're kind of looking at as we study Paul here. Paul's humility in seeking unity and peace in the church of Jerusalem, because he's kind of in a tough spot here. In Acts 21, we've read of how Paul was headed to Jerusalem. Again and again, he'd been warned, stay away from Jerusalem. There's trouble there. And his followers pleaded with him not to go. A prophet came from Jerusalem, tied his hands and feet, and said, you will be bound just like this if you go to Jerusalem. Paul persisted. And eventually his followers, after just kind of giving up on him, said, the Lord's will be done. And Paul continued on to Jerusalem. And it's a little easier to understand Paul's drive, this inner compulsion to Jerusalem, when we understand the historical setting of Jerusalem. So you know I'm a history teacher, so you're just going to have to bear this with me. Jerusalem in the late 50s, and I don't mean the 1950s, I mean the 0050s. I had to clarify that. Was going through an extremely nationalistic phase. There was xenophobia. They didn't like outsiders. They were against Gentiles, especially because of the Romans. Violence was bursting in the city. It wasn't safe to really be a Gentile. The Emperor Caligula was interfering in the temple, and the governors were awful. The current governor at this time was a man named Marcus Antonius Felix. He was harsh, he didn't put up with anything, and he was corrupt. So he was easily bribed. One Roman historian said he thought he could do any evil act with impunity. Josephus even tells us that he arranged the murder of the high priest. And this environment caused the Jews to become untrusting and even adversarial to the Romans and just outsiders in general. Gentiles weren't just unclean, they were enemies. It would be dangerous just being a Gentile in Judea. It would be dangerous to be a Jew who associated with Gentiles in Judea, as Paul was. There was hatred building up. Any devotion to Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, and the Jewish nation was becoming a litmus test for all Jews. You had to do this or you were not a good Jew. And here we see Paul arriving in verse 17 in Jerusalem. And he's arriving with Gentiles in tow, with gifts. We read in Corinthians 16, Romans 15, Acts 24. He has gifts from the Gentile churches to the church in Jerusalem. It's a love gift to the mother church. And Paul felt it was necessary, that's why he's there, to present it personally to bring them words of encouragement also from the Gentile churches. He was hoping to make a practical statement to break down some of the walls of division that were building up in the church. So when Luke opens this scene, and in Acts 21, verse 17, he says, "When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly." Paul and the Gentiles, that in itself may be miraculous. The core of the Jerusalem church is holding strong. In fact, it's spreading. There is some hatred, though, in the church itself. So let me pray, and then we are going to dive into the passage. Acts chapter 21, verses 17 through 36 is what we'll be studying today. Please pray with me. Father, as we study your word and the actions of Paul, the actions of James and the other elders, may it touch our hearts as well. I pray that you do teach us how to deal humbly with one another. Teach us to be peacemakers, I pray, through this passage, and just move in our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to read a piece of this at a time this morning instead of reading the whole thing. I told Dom when I put it on my word processor and it's more than a page, I think I should break it up instead of reading it for you all at once. So Acts 21, I'm just going to read the first few verses, 17 through 20. "When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God." The politics weren't good in Jerusalem at the time, but they were greeted warmly and with pleasure. It's the same word used in Acts 2:14 to describe the first converts in Jerusalem. They received the gospel warmly. There was great joy as Paul and his companions came in and told them of what was going on outside of Jerusalem and outside of Judea. And the next day, James, the leader of the church, the half-brother of Jesus, and the elders, the leadership of the church, call Paul before them. And they listen as Paul recounts the amazing work of God in saving Gentiles all over Greece and Asia Minor. The language makes it clear that he did so in detail. He didn't just summarize, he gave names, he gave places, he told stories about what had happened, many of which we've gone through. Luke has recorded for us in Acts, but I'm sure there are many more. This was not Paul's first account to these elders about the work in the Gentile world. In chapter 15, Paul had recounted God's work of salvation among the nations. But that was many years earlier. Now they listen once more as Paul told them how God was continuing to build his church. And when they heard this, they praised God. They celebrated, they worshiped God for the work he was doing through Paul and through others. However, that wasn't where they stopped. There was a but. There was a however. It goes on and says, "Then they said to Paul, 'You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So what do we tell you? So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, and that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we've written to them our decision, that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." Paul and his companions have finally reached Jerusalem. We spent a long time on their journey there. To their credit, James and the elders welcomed them. We have to imagine they were fully aware of what welcoming Paul might mean in this political time. But they were in a difficult situation. They were worried that when people heard that Paul had arrived, they would come to them and say, "Why are you welcoming this man?" They had supported Paul's witness to the Gentiles, but now Paul was unpopular among the Jewish populace. And not just the Jews, but the recent Christian converts among the Jews. They make a point. These people are still zealous for the law. They were happy how God was working among the Gentiles. They said, "As for the Gentiles, we've written them a letter." But they were fearful that Paul would be a liability in Jerusalem to the Jerusalem church because of these rumors about him. They've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to consider their children or live according to our customs. They heard that Paul had betrayed his Jewish background, told Jewish Christians that it was wrong for them to continue Jewish laws and customs. These were false rumors. Paul didn't have any problem with Jewish Christians who continued to exercise and observe their old customs. He says in Romans 14, 4-6, "Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master servants stand or fall, and they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand. One person considers one day more sacred than another, another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so for the Lord and gives thanks to God." While Paul no longer believed that obedience to Jewish law was necessary to salvation, he was still a Jew. He himself observed Jewish cultural practices. He didn't discourage other Jews from doing so. In fact, we read in Acts that he had Timothy circumcised to help with the ministry among the Jewish people. So the elders came up with a plan. They knew that these rumors were false too, so they came up with a plan to refute these rumors, to prove to the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem that Paul was a good Jew. He hadn't abandoned the customs. To make him seem less like a threat to the Jews, to relieve some tension among the Jews and the Christians, to advise him to participate publicly in a Jewish ceremonial rite with 4 other men. Not only that, but Paul was to pay all their expenses. They go on to say they realize this isn't a Gentile issue. They've already written to the Gentiles. Paul was being slanderously misrepresented. The church leaders understood, but they couldn't ignore the effect of these rumors. They had to be addressed. They saw this as the perfect opportunity. Perhaps they were hoping that Paul would deal with these once and for all by being seen at the temple undergoing these purification rites. Before we move on to how this plan turned out, spoiler alert, not well, I want to draw the lesson here from Paul that I think is key for us all. Note Paul's humility when they bring this to him. There's not a suggestion that he was defensive or angry. Instead, he's willing to be part of the solution here. Paul submitted to the authority of the elders in James. Paul, you see, was living out a principle, and he explains this principle in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share its blessings." James and the elders are basically saying to Paul, will you help us keep the peace here? We're not asking that you compromise your principles. We're asking that you be a Jew to the Jews. Go above and beyond, Paul, please, for the sake of peace. And they add, don't worry, remember the council. We do want to welcome the Gentile believers. But we have to welcome you in a specific way, in a way that our members and our neighbors can accept. All of this for the sake, Paul, of the gospel. And Paul's response was absolutely an act of humility and an act of love. I like how this commentator captures Paul's motives. Says he had rejected the law as a means of justification, not as a mode of life. He did not trust to its observance to secure his salvation, but he practiced its ceremonies as one who loved his nation and who was glad to avoid any needless offense to his fellow countrymen. It was quite permissible for the Christian Jews to observe ceremonial laws, even dietary laws. Even today, there are people that observe dietary laws and customs. Romans 14 makes the case that it's not necessarily wrong for them to do that. The point is that Paul was not compromising the truth of the gospel, and neither were the church leaders in asking him to go through these rites. In fact, 25 makes it clear that there was no expectation for the Gentile believers to do this. The most important lesson that we can take from this is the need for personal humility. In keeping the peace, not just for peace sake, but for the sake of the gospel. Paul was the wronged party here. He was the one that rumors were being spread, false rumors. He had betrayed, the rumor said he had betrayed his people and his nation. It would have been easy for Paul and for any of us in this situation to react angrily, to demand that the people spreading these rumors be found and dealt with. Perhaps even to refuse to associate with believers that had a hint of these rumors. He could have insisted that James and the elders condemn these rumors and publicly voice their support for Paul. Paul didn't do any of that. He bowed his head and he bowed his heart in humility. And he agreed to obey this ceremony in order to prove that all these accusations were false. He did this for the sake of unity, for the sake of peace, ultimately for the sake of the gospel, so that the gospel could spread more easily among the Jews. It wouldn't be hindered. Paul saw an opportunity for peace in order to promote unity, to correct the misunderstandings. Paul sacrificed his own pride for a higher purpose. He practiced humility for the sake of peace and accepted the elders' plan. Unfortunately, as he did so, as he went to the temple, some of these people that had been spreading the rumors met him there. We read in verse 26, the next day Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and assumed Paul had brought him into the temple. While Paul was going through these purification rites at the temple, some of the Jews from Asia that had spread these rumors and opposed his ministry there see him, and they begin to stir up the crowd. And they give these false accusations, and all of them are false. And it's a little ironic that it's Paul there trying to prove that he's a good Jew, and they're accusing him of not being one. He's accused of attacking them. The first accusation is that he's teaching against the Jewish people. It wasn't true. Paul longed for the Jews to come to Christ. Romans 9, 2-4 says, "I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my race, the people of Israel." Paul didn't have anything against the Jews. He wanted them to come to Christ. Then they accused Paul of teaching against the temple and the law. But he's in the temple. He's fulfilling the law. He's not against it. And lastly, and here's the key accusation, the one that carries the death penalty. They accuse Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple. That was what Stephen was accused of. It's a death penalty when you defile the temple. Paul wasn't defiling the temple, he was being purified at the temple. All of these were baseless accusations, but these false rumors about Paul were not new. They were well known among the populace. And in this time of cultural zeal, it was easy for these accusations to take root. And at this time, it was the time of Pentecost. There were great crowds in Jerusalem. And pretty soon we read the whole city was aroused. People came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some of the officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Get rid of him." They succeed in stirring up the crowd. They drag Paul out of the temple. They begin to beat him, intending to kill him. But the Romans are on the lookout for unrest in the city. In fact, there was a large Roman fortress right there next to the temple. They quickly respond, and when they arrive, they go to the center of the issue. And it was Paul. He was on the ground being beaten. They arrest him. He may not have instigated the riot, but he was clearly the cause of the riot. They chain him between 2 soldiers, and then the commander, after arresting him, says, "What has this man done?" He can't tell because there's such an uproar. One person's yelling one thing, another something else. Eventually he says, "We're just going to take him to the barracks and figure all this out later." They start to take him to the barracks, but more and more people crowd around. There's increasing violence. And eventually the soldiers have to pick Paul up and carry him. I kind of picture people grabbing him and hitting him on the way by until eventually the soldiers just have to pick him up and get to the barracks. And all of this was because Paul had agreed to graciously humble himself in order to keep the peace. Paul will later write in Romans 12, "Be careful what you do is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." I think we live in a world, in a nation not so unlike this nation of Jerusalem in the mid-1st century. It seems like our culture, especially lately, is in a constant cycle of us versus them. Natural-born citizens versus immigrants, Republicans versus Democrats, minorities versus law enforcement. We're told that each side is right by each side. More than that, we're told the other side is completely wrong. And obviously, to us at least, where our sympathies are is the right side. And I realize that I might be stepping on some toes this morning as I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Proud, righteous condemnation of others is not what we are called to as followers of Christ. We are called to humility and peace. And the goal is not peace itself. That's not the goal. It's not merely peace. The goal is to reach people with the gospel of Christ so that they can be saved. James, the one who advised Paul here in Acts, wrote in James 3, 17 and 18, But the wisdom above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. We can't go proud, righteous condemnation. We can't use it to drive people into God's arms. Humility and love is used to invite people into the arms of Christ. Paul here in Acts was living out this humility. And it's the humility he saw in his own Lord, which he talks about in Philippians. In Philippians 2, he comes to this conclusion: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. But we also see the reason that Paul wrote, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. There's a part of peace that we cannot control because it depends on other people. We can be peaceful, we can be peacemakers. So far as it depended on Paul, he had done that. But the result was a riot. He went out of his way to work for peace. He humbled himself. He put aside his pride, just as the church always should, where it doesn't compromise the gospel. But Paul doesn't want us to be surprised when our efforts at peace aren't always met with peace, as far as it depends on you. And that's okay. It's difficult, but that's okay. Jesus in the Beatitudes speaks a blessing for those who seek peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. But the next two verses speak of conflict. Conflict for the sake of Christ, and also the blessings that are found in conflict. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Paul had received a lot of blessings on this day, both as a peacemaker and as persecuted. Let me be absolutely clear as I wrap this up this morning. Paul sought peace, but he never sought peace at the expense of the gospel. He never compromised the message of Christ's life, his death, and his resurrection for the sake of peace. And it's very clear also that Paul championed morality among the churches. He clearly called for Christians to practice morality in their daily lives and in the church. But Paul sought peace in areas where cultural and personal opinions and preferences could be set aside for the good of unity, for the sake of the gospel, so that people would believe. He wanted people to believe, be forgiven, and be saved. And he was willing to set aside his own personal preferences to see that that was done. I ask that you just consider this as you move about your week this week. How much of what we fight for and about in our personal lives and in our culture springs not out of our concern for the gospel or even our concern about morality, but just comes out of our own pride and selfishness? James, the one who advised Paul here in Acts, wrote, I think I've read this, where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. Just encourage you this week as peacemakers for the gospel to live out Paul's words in Philippians. In humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Please pray. Father, we are yours first and foremost. Help us to cling to the gospel as your truth, as your word. Never compromise that. But Lord, where there are things that we prefer or that we see in our culture is right. I pray that you teach us humility, that we look to others, that we put them first for the sake of unity, for the sake of peace, so that we can spread the gospel into those areas. Lord, please never let our pride or our selfish ambition stand in the way of the gospel. We thank you for the lesson here that we have from Paul and for Luke's recording of it. Lord, I just ask that you go with us from this place with that thought in our mind. In Jesus' name.